I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Wendy Lesser. Dr. Lesser is the founding and current editor of the Threepenny Review and author of several books, both fiction and nonfiction. Her current is a biography of the architect Louis Kahn titled You Say to Brick, and will be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in March 2017. She has received awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy in Berlin, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Daedalus Foundation, and many institutions. And she is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as of the New York Institute for the Humanities. Her journalistic writing about literature, dance, film, and music has appeared in a number of periodicals in America and abroad. Born in California and educated at Harvard, Cambridge, and Berkeley, Lesser now divides her time between Berkeley and New York. Her lecture today, Louis Kahn as Artist and Collaborator, explores the premise that an architect is by definition also a collaborator. And in bringing his architectural masterpieces to fruition, Kahn depended on his ability to stimulate others as much as on his own innate talent, using the Salk Institute and the Kimball Museum as examples. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lesser.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, San Diego Museum of Art, for bringing me here. Dr. Lesser reminds me of a family member that's a dermatologist. I just have a Ph.D. in English, and I'm Wendy. And in the same vein, although I will attempt to remember that the person we're honoring today is Louis Kahn and try and call him Kahn, I will slip often into calling him Lou, because that's what his family members call him. If you heard last night's conversation with his 3 children, they call him Lou. His colleagues all called him Lou. I imagine even his students, the ones that went to work for him, called him Lou, so I will unavoidably be slipping into that. The book cover is up because I'm not going to be doing PowerPoint. This is not only because I'm a technological incompetent, but it's also because my colleagues in this symposium will be showing you a lot of slides, and also because you can go over and see in person these great pictures and sketches and paintings and so forth that I'll be talking about in the exhibit here, and you can drive 15 or 20 miles up the coast and see one of his greatest constructions, the Salk Institute. And so you don't need me to show you these things. I will talk to you about them. I won't talk about the Kimball because I think just talking about collaboration on Salk will take up the second half of my talk. But the first half is about Louis Kahn as artist. And he thought of himself as an artist first, and I think forever, but he certainly was an artist from the time he was very young. Let me read you something that he said himself about the very young Lou. I remember having come over with my mother and sister and brother on the boat from Estonia. I was 5 years old. Because I could draw, I made drawings of whatever happened. And one of the things he drew was, as they were pulling out of Liverpool, which is where they took the transatlantic boat from, he drew a boat that had its smoke going backwards. The captain called my attention to it. And because he liked the drawing so much, my mother thought we would give it to him. As a result, we had oranges every day, and that was really something. Oranges were a rare thing, and I was very proud. And I think his art did make him proud in that way, and it seemed to him to bring tangible accomplishments. His earliest memory, this is when he was 5, his earliest memory was when he was 2 years old. He was interviewed in 1958 for a creativity study at UC Berkeley, and the interviewer asked him, "What is your earliest memory?" And he said, "When I was 2 years old, I remember drawing with my finger on a frozen window pane." That was in Estonia, on the island where he lived his first 5 years. So his earliest memory is of him being an artist of sorts. His very early memory of coming over to America is that. And then when he got here, he was a foreign kid. He had scars all over his face because he'd been in a burning accident when he was 3 years old. He was sickly. He stayed out of school for the first year because he had scarlet fever. So he got to school and he was teased by the other kids. Also, he was not very good at school. He didn't, have an academic mind in that way as a very young person, but he could draw. And when he started to draw in elementary school, all the teasing was converted into people admiring him. And the teachers who thought he couldn't learn math or reading very well realized that he had this incredible talent of being able to draw. This had been encouraged in his family because even though they were poor, very poor immigrants living all over the Northern Liberties section of Philadelphia, having to move because they couldn't afford to stay where they were, his mother had been a harpist back in the old country, and his father had been a stained glass artist. And so there was a very strong encouragement of art in his family. And he responded to that by becoming an artist, but also by, to a certain extent, resenting the family involvement. He says, "One day I was copying a portrait of Napoleon. His left eye was giving me trouble. Already I'd erased the drawing several times. My father lovingly corrected my work. I threw pencil and paper across the room saying, 'Now it's your drawing, not mine.'" So I want you to keep in mind that childish behavior when we get to the part about him as collaborator, and when he gave up that business about it's mine, not mine, feeling entirely. Okay, so I said that the teachers had noticed he was a good artist, and in Philadelphia at that time, which is now we're talking about 1912 or so, when he was 11 years old, if you were good at art, in the public schools, you could go one day a week to classes that were taught for free by a man named J. Liberty Tadd, who was a progressive education person, but also an artist himself who had been trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So Lou's teachers picked him out and said, yes, you can go study with J. Liberty Tadd. And this period from when he was 11 to maybe 12, 13, of just a few years of his life was very formative. J. Liberty Tadd had these ideas about art education that included drawing from nature, so that he would bring in little skeletons and stuffed animals and things that he found in nature and have the kids draw that. He would bring in photographs of those things and have them draw that. And he also gave them exercises like drawing simultaneously with both hands on a blackboard. Now, if you've ever seen these wonderful photographs of Lou in mature adulthood, drawing simultaneously with both hands, a circle, he took that directly from the training with Tadd. He probably had a talent for it to begin with, but it was cultivated by the training with Tadd. Another thing Tadd did was he had them model things in 3 dimensions, first out of clay and then out of wood. He said, first a soft material, then a hard, and if they could see the thing in 3 dimensions, then they could draw it even better. Well, one of the things that colleagues later commented upon about Lou was what a great 3-dimensional quality he had, even when he was drawing things in 2 dimensions. He understood 3 dimensions, and I think Tadd encouraged that talent that he had already. And then Tadd kind of picked up on something that was to become essential to Lou. This is something that Tadd wrote in his 1899 book, New Methods of Education. "Drawing and manual training, properly taught, are modes of thought expression, just as speech and writing are modes of thought expression. One who accurately draws a bird or a skeleton or a flower or a mathematical problem has a more complete mastery of that special topic than could be gained in almost any other way." And I think you can see in the adult Kahn, the one that became the architect, how that was borne out. I mean, for instance, there's a wonderful book by Michael Merrill about the unbuilt Dominican mother house called Drawing to Find Out. That was Lou's method, drawing to find out. And Shamsul Waris, who's a Bangladeshi architect who met Lou when he was over in Dhaka building his great masterpiece, the National Assembly building of Bangladesh, Waris said to me about Lou, "He is unlike many architects who instantly conceive what they want to do. He is someone who can put up his ideas through his drawings, not through his brain, but through his drawings. He cannot come to the final version at the beginning." And I think you'll see that in the show, too. So he was great at art, and art carried him through high school. I mean, he was still a terrible student, but he could draw, and in his senior year of high school, he took an architecture course with a man named William Gray. And this was the other great turning point in his life. He realized he wanted to be an architect. Meanwhile, he was winning prizes all over the city for his drawings and paintings. He won the watercolor prize for the year given by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he won freehand drawing prizes and all this. Every year, he was the sort of king of high school students in terms of his art. But he had decided he wanted to go to architecture school, and he applied to the University of Pennsylvania architecture program. So when he got into the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts as a scholarship art student, his father wanted him to go there, but Lou wanted to be an architect, and he really stood up against the family because he had to pay for himself to go to architecture school. He did not have a scholarship there. So he had to use his own earnings. He played the piano and the organ in silent movie houses, and he took out loans, and he worked in architecture offices in the summer, and that's how he paid for himself to go through college and become an architect. Just a sidelight, he taught himself to play the piano pretty much too. I mean, he sat behind a chair while a little girl had lessons, and then he would go and practice when she left, and he could play by ear wonderfully, and all his life he was very interested in music. It was another thing like his visual art that he didn't pursue professionally, but maybe he could have. So, all right, he became an architect. He got to skip all the courses about drawing in college. He was way ahead of everybody else on that front. And he graduated from Penn and became a professional architect. He had this to say about the difference between being a painter and an architect. A painter can make doorways smaller than people. A sculptor can make square wheels on a carriage to express the futility of war. The architect has to make doors bigger than people and has to use round wheels. So not only did the architect have to be practical, but the architect, as he learned, had to depend on other people. And this turned out to be something that Lou was brilliant at. So rather than talk about a bunch of his projects, I'm going to focus on the Salk as the illustration of collaboration. Oh, good, I have plenty of time to do that. And take you through the kinds of collaboration that an architect does when his own artistic talents are only part of what's going on. So the first thing the architect needs to collaborate with is the site. And Salk is a great example of that. You can see how he used the site, how that runnel of water that runs down the middle of the plaza is the exact place the sun sets in the solstice, and how he used the ocean breezes that come in to cool the offices that are there in the studies that the scientists have in those wonderful jagged-edged front row of studies. And there are all sorts of ways. If you go and take the tour, and you can, as a civilian, go, I think on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I forget what the days are, but there's a noon tour that's always given, which is the first thing I did at the Salk. And usually a volunteer architect gives it and shows you all the things that Lou did that take advantage of the site and its natural qualities. I mean, it's hard to imagine there could be an architect who would go to that site and not focus it toward the Pacific Ocean, but I imagine there could have been one, and he was not that person. The second thing the architect has to, second kind of collaboration that the architect has to have is with his client. And again, the Salk is a great example, and Lou always listed Jonas Salk as his favorite client. I mean, even at the end of his life, he was saying Jonas Salk was his favorite client. And this was not because Jonas Salk was a pushover. Jonas Salk was a client who really, got in there and helped plan the building. And so Ariel talked about the color of the concrete and that it had this pinkish color. Jonas Salk helped Lou pick that color. They had, a range of choices. It's in the cement that you get the color. And they together chose that color. And Jonas Salk watched the early castings of concrete and helped Lou pick what it should look like. But much earlier than that, Jonas Salk not only went and picked out Lou as the architect, but after the building had been through a couple of designs and had arrived at what they thought was the final design, they came out to California in early 1962, and they were walking around the site, and they were interviewing people to do the construction. They chose the construction team. The very next day, they were supposed to fly up to Northern California to meet with the March of Dimes people that were funding the Salk Institute and present their finished plan, this nice drawn-out plan that Lou's office had designed. And Jonas Salk had second thoughts. This original design, by the way, was wide, lower office buildings with two very narrow gardens in them, very narrow, and then these big buildings. So Jonas Salk goes walking around the site by himself. It was twilight, he recalled. I tried to imagine how the buildings would look, and I must say, I suddenly became terribly unhappy. Okay, the next day they're on the airplane. They're going to San Francisco to present the project. Well, I told Lou on the plane the next morning that I thought we had to start over again because I really was not happy about the plans. And I sketched for him what I thought I didn't like and also what I thought was needed. And he referred to the gardens as not gardens, but alleys, you know, and he didn't like that. And then Lou instantly, and this was one of his great characteristics, he saw that that was a better idea, what Kahn was saying. Junked the plans, started all over again, and came up with what we see now. And that, Salk said, he was always very kind in saying, I gave him the opportunity to build a better building. So you can see it's a great interaction, which he had with a number of his other clients, but none so strongly, I think, as Salk. Okay, another kind of collaboration is with materials. And at Salk, that was concrete. And there's a man who represents the concrete at Salk, and that is Fred Langford. He's this wonderful guy in his 80s who now lives in New Jersey and designs golf courses and amusement parks and things that require the shaping of concrete and other materials. But he was a young 34-year-old guy who had worked in construction before he got his architecture degree and had gone to work for Lou in 1961. And the Salk project really got going in 62. That's when construction started. And Lou sent him out to supervise the concrete part of the work in California. He also sent at the same time his 28-year-old project architect, Jack McAllister. So these two young guys, 28 and 34, are sent to California to deal with the project. And Fred became obsessed with concrete. Before he came out here, Lou said to him, what do you know about concrete, Fred? And Fred said, nothing. And Lou said, that makes two of us. So they researched. I mean, of course they knew about concrete. They'd gone to architecture school. But they really looked into it, and they looked at all the samples from all the different concrete places, and they found the sample that had the right volcanic ash and the pinkish color. And then Fred was obsessed with making everything both functional and beautiful. So it was Fred that, you know, helped line up those holes that you see at the Salk that had never been revealed in previous pieces of concrete. They would always be patched with other concrete, so you wouldn't see the form holes where the concrete gets tied into its plywood forms. That would be hidden. But Fred made them even and symmetrical, and they could be preserved and just patched with lead or something that would show, so that you would see essentially the little belly button of the concrete, where it was born. And Fred made forms that could be reused, and so that beautiful effect you have of the look of the concrete and how smooth it is, that's because of the way the forms were preserved, and they had a certain kind of resin on them and everything, but they could use them over and over again, so it was a less expensive process. And Fred was actually able to patent that process. And what Jack McAllister told me, before I'd even met Fred, Jack said, when Lou saw what Fred could do with concrete, he got even more into concrete, and he wanted to use it more because he saw what a wonderful material it was. So that's a way in which both the material and the person that got to know it well were his collaborators. Obviously, another collaborator is his engineer, and in this case, his engineer was August Commandant, who's famous in Lou circles. He helped with the Salk, he helped with the Kimball, he was briefly involved in the National Assembly building in Dhaka. I look around as if there's going to be one behind me, but it isn't. But you can see the pictures of it in the show. And August Commandant was a very difficult person. Another engineer of Lou's, Nick Giannopoulos, told me most people only work with him once. But Lou could work with him, and he worked with him over and over again. Lou himself was not of an engineering turn of mind. In that same creativity study where he talked about being 2 years old and drawing, they said, do you have any lacks as an architect? And he said, well, engineering and things like that, but it's not an important lack. And the reason it wasn't an important lack is because he could work so closely with these people who could do it. And also because he understood what they need to do. Nick Giannopoulos said to me, Lou may not have been good at engineering, but he had this classical training that involved putting large stones one upon the other. And that's what he cared about, and that is engineering of a sort. And so he could envision what engineering could do. And what August Commandant did was revised the Vierendeel trusses that they used in the Richards building to create open lab spaces and made them even more, tensile, with greater ability to have longer spaces, so you get this whole long open lab at the Salk. And he also helped him design those interstitial floors, the floors that go between the labs that have enabled the current administration of facilities at the Salk to redo the entire technical part of the building, heat and electricity and ventilation, everything that makes the building work as a scientific building. They've been able to redo that without moving the scientists out of their offices at all because of these brilliant interstitial floors. And so Commandant crucially helped with that. And then the final collaborator, maybe the most important one from our point of view as casual visitors, was Luis Barragan, the Mexican architect, who Lou found out about because they had photos of their work in one MoMA, Museum of Modern Art publication, and Lou saw these photos of Barragan's gardens, and he had this Spanish-speaking guy from his office call up Barragan and say, I'm calling from Louis Kahn's office, and Barragan says, who's he? And that's what the man on the phone tells Lou. He says, who are you? And Lou says, tell him to ask some of his architect friends. Anyway, in the end, they got together, they got along very well, and Lou flew Barragan up here in February of 1966. The buildings were all built, and there was this big mud expanse between them, and the idea had been to put a garden there. And Barragan looks and he says, you don't want a garden, you want a plaza. And Lou tells this story frequently. He looks at Salk, Salk looks at him, they nod, a plaza. That's what they wanted. It was this great realization. And then that wasn't the end of it, because then Lou had to decide how to pave the plaza. And so he first wanted a stone called recinto, which is a dark gray stone. And then he wanted the pink that's at the San Miguel de Allende Cathedral. And neither of these was possible, luckily for us. And so he imported travertine from Italy, the largest importation of travertine that had occurred at that point. Jack McAllister told me it was cheaper than vinyl tile to use travertine. And so we have this beautiful, luminous space that would not look like that if it had not been for all these people in this chain, including chance of cost at the end. I just want to say one other thing in response to the interesting and moving interview that Ariel did last night with the three Kahn children, Nathaniel Kahn, Alexandra Ting, and Sue Ann Kahn. And he asked them how their father had influenced them, and they had some general answers to that were modest and interesting, but I want to say how I think he influenced them and us. So his musical abilities, which he never developed, but which were intense and commented on by everybody that knew him. And he was always playing the piano at dinner parties, at get-togethers where the guys in the office were drinking, at all sorts of occasions. And that was directly inherited by his daughter, Sue Ann, who's a professional flutist. His abilities as an artist, which continued through his life, and which you can see when you go to the exhibit, some of the paintings he did that are not related to his architecture work. He had wonderful drawings that are architectural, and you'll see those too. Drawings from his 1928-29 tour of Europe. But in the exhibit are a couple of paintings that I particularly love. One is called Esther in Pink, and it was a portrait he painted of his wife when she was pregnant with their child, Sue Ann. And then there's another that's a coastal village in Nova Scotia that he painted after a trip that he took with Esther and their friends, the Shermans, in 1936, of a village not very different from the one he grew up in on the Baltic Sea, only this was up in Nova Scotia. And you can see wonderful effects of light in that. There's a wonderful pencil sketch, self-portrait with pipe, that he did of himself in 1930. Anyway, you can see his artistic talent in the show. That went directly into his daughter, Alexandra. But last night, Nathaniel Kahn said, well, I didn't inherit my sister's talents, you know, the ones that he had handed out to them. But what he inherited was the genius for collaboration that Lou had. And so Nathaniel is a filmmaker, another kind of work that requires getting everybody else to do their best, not just you, having an overall vision. And so that's the way, I think, in which he directly passed something along to his three children. And to us, what did he do? He gave us this sense that you can enter a building and become something more than you were when you were outside of it. It lifts you up, it makes you feel like you're bigger than you were, but also like you are utterly human and you're completely aware of your own body in the space. And he said about the baths of Caracalla in Rome, he said, we know that we can bathe just as well under an 8-foot ceiling as we can under a 150-foot ceiling. But I believe that there's something about a 150-foot ceiling that makes a man a different kind of man. And I think his buildings make us a different kind of person. Thanks.